Welcome to Season 4 of the Knack for Business podcast.
So we have a question for the audience. Why spend years building from scratch when you can grow faster by buying an existing business? That's exactly what David will talk about in this episode. He'll share why acquisition can be a smarter path than starting from zero, how to access funding beyond the startup world, and what structures help founders stay focused and scale with confidence. Staying tuned, and what structures help founders stay focused and scale with confidence. Stay tuned if you've been wondering how to grow smarter, not harder. This conversation is for you. Our guest today is Dave McFarland from FocusOPEX. He is an investor, advisor, coach, and author with more than 35 years of experience in research and manufacturing. He's worked across medical devices, electronics, plastics, and machining, bringing a broad perspective to business challenges. Through his company FocusOPEX, Dave helps businesses grow, coaches, consultants, and on gaining equity and supports founders in raising capital. Dave, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here today. Do you have a favorite quote or saying that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I actually do. It's by St. Francis of Assisi, right? He said, start by doing what's necessary, then do what's possible, and suddenly you are doing the impossible. So that's words I live by.
So don't build it. Where does this mindset come from, and how does that all work?
Yeah, so it comes from the fact that it was something that I didn't used to know, and I learned about it. And I think it's important for founders to know this. So I brush up against quite a fair number of startup founders, and they go through these incubators or other types of programs where they have this process where you go out, you do this raise and you get money, you give away equity. You do another raise, you get money, you give away equity. And what I have found is that isn't the only way to do it. In fact, especially in manufacturing, if you have a widget that you want to produce, it might be a much better way to go out and find a company that has the resources that you need and buy that company and start producing your widget instead of trying to raise a bunch of money and then go out and build what you need. It could be a lot faster to go this route by buying it instead of building it. And B, in a lot of ways, it's easier to raise money to buy a company than it is to raise money to fund a company.
Dave, I'm really interested about due diligence and when companies don't do it as well as they should have.
Yeah, I mean, that's always a possibility. So yeah, you should never do an acquisition without having the right team to do the due diligence, because there could be things hidden in the closet that aren't obvious to you, but if you have a professional that does this, they could find those things. And the financial aspects are usually, it's a little bit harder to hide that, but legal matters could be lurking, right? So if they didn't tell you about a disgruntled employee that left that's getting ready to sue them, or perhaps an old lawsuit that didn't quite get settled all the way, or if you discover that they're actually maybe not in legal compliance in some way. So the legal compliance on the due diligence, I think is the bigger piece.
Wow. Have you had an instance where that's happened, where someone you've been helping along has gone down that and all of a sudden found, oh, look, a flat tire?
So I don't know if it would fall in the legal or the financial, but I came across a situation where a small company had signed a contract with a factoring company, right? So they were doing accounts receivable factoring. And that contract was so restrictive, it was going to make things very difficult to move forward.
Ouch. And that's unfortunate because factoring is meant to make it quicker. You get your funding faster than going through a bank.
Yeah, but the problem with factoring is that you're mortgaging the future to pay for the present.
That looks like it should be on a brochure somewhere in our back that we can stare.
Yeah. So yeah, factoring will solve your current cash flow problems, but they're going to create future cash flow problems, right? Because it's going to eat into your profit. And the problem that I've seen is a lot of people start that factoring and they think it's going to be a short-term solution, but they just, it's like they've started digging the hole and they can't stop, and it just gets worse over time. And that's what happened in this case. And there were personal guarantees on it. It was just really difficult, and it was going to be hard to unwind that.
Guessing, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm guessing that your supply chain are the best places to either acquire or be acquired because you know the best about what you're doing. Is that fair?
That's certainly one way to do it. So, it's they either call them, vertical or horizontal acquisitions, right? So you can acquire a company that's kind of like yours, right, and add capacity if that's what you need. Or let's say Henry Ford's a good example of this, right? He owned his whole supply chain, right? And so that can actually be a good business model as well. And it really just depends on your strategy and what you need. Another strategy, the one that I employ personally, is I like to have several companies in the space that serve the same customers but sell different products. So for instance, if component makers is a good example, if you have an electronics component maker, a metal maker, and a plastic maker, they serve a lot of the same companies. So you can become kind of a turnkey solution for all of those things if you do an acquisition that way.
Do you find that it's easier to do, buy that other company to help support your end goals? If they're close by, they have to be in the same state, same country. Does it matter? Does it help?
I think if it's closer, it's always going to be easier in case there's a fire that you have to go personally attend to. But I mean, think of it this way. A lot of these startups, they outsource their product being built to China, right? So at the end of the day, you can do it either way. But yeah, closer is easier. But if you live someplace that doesn't have that, then of course you're going to have to look a little further away.
Something that I see that I don't understand, but I want to, I think, is the whole concept of a fragile or anti-fragile company.
Yeah, so this comes from a book, right? So Nassim Taleb wrote a book called Anti-Fragile, and he explains in there the difference between the two. So a lot of people would think the opposite of fragile is robust, right? But robust means that it's just resistant to change, right? So robust means whatever you throw at it, positive or negative, it doesn't move in either direction, right? A fragile company, what it means is that if there's a positive stimulus, it grows, right? But if there's a negative stimulus, it's more that offsets the positive stimulus. And in his book, the example he gives is banks. He says banks are by design fragile organizations because eventually something's going to happen and they're going to blow up. And he said it's shown time and time again. So a bank will often make risky bets for a little bit of profit, and that's okay until it isn't. And so what he said is that, he really believes that eventually every bank, something will happen that they'll lose not just a year's worth, 2 years worth, all the money they've ever made. One bad event can take out their lifetime earnings. That's the fragile. We've seen it. And that's why he wrote a book about it. And so that's a very fragile organization. Anti-fragile is just the opposite. It means, when you get a positive stimulus, yes, you grow. But when you get a negative stimulus, it doesn't kill you. And then after the negative stimulus, it actually helps you, right? So an anti-fragile organization actually grows from negative stimulus and from pain. And so he likened it to the mythical creature, the Hydra, right? The Hydra, right? You cut off a head. Well, that's an injury, but it grows back stronger with two heads, right? And so that's the difference. So every organization and every individual even, you would want to be anti-fragile.
So is that just from an economics perspective, or is it also reputational?
It basically every aspect you can think of, right? So to build a true anti-fragile organization, you'd want to think about it in many different ways and try to have processes and risk reduction in place so that, okay, that bad event's coming, right? What can we do to prepare ourselves so when it happens, it doesn't kill us? And the funny thing about this is it's, you can only prepare for what you see coming, right? And so one of Taleb's other books was called The Black Swan, right? And so Black Swan event is something that's unforeseen, has never happened before. And so that's the real test for an anti-fragile company is can it handle a Black Swan event? So something that you didn't see coming, but just because the inherent structure of your company, it's actually resistant and grows from that.
So I see you have a background from medical devices, electronics, plastics, and chemicals. That's really a varied background, kind of roughly in the same ballpark, but not. How'd that evolve? I mean, that's gives you a great understanding of many things.
Well, I have a degree in biology. So I started out in the biomedical world, right? And then about halfway through my career, I worked for a small biotech company and I got more into quality management and dealing with problems in the factory. And so when I left that company, that's where I stayed. So the manufacturing places where I spend most of my time now. I still am comfortable in the medical device, the pharma, and the biotech space, but I really spend more time in those other places. So I visited a lot of factory floors where they made electronics, plastics, metals, chemicals, a little bit. My very first job, real job, was actually as a production chemist before I got my degree. So I know that space a little bit as well.
So, one of the reasons to buy a company is to get you a head start. You get a little further down the road. How do you put metrics in for the difference between buying the company and actually understanding enough to run the company? How do you qualify that time where you own it, but you don't have the foggiest clue of what you're doing? How do you factor that time in?
Well, I think it's a fallacy to think that you have to know everything about the company to run the company, right? So, and in fact, if you operate your company that way, it's hard to grow. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're a welder, right? And you start a welding company and you know a lot about welding. The problem is they don't tend to learn a lot about running the business. They just learn welding and that limits their growth, right? But if you went the other way around, you say, okay, I'm an inventor and I built a widget and we need a lot of welding expertise to build this widget. I don't have to know anything about welding. I just have to know about my widget, right? And so if you bought a company that has the welding, the idea is they already know how to weld, right? What you're buying is the expertise, right? And let them do what they do and you just kind of oversee it. The people that do this well, I have a friend, he owns 25 businesses, right? He doesn't run the businesses. What he knew is he understood their business model. He understood they produce good cash flow, and then he just kind of lets them run it. Warren Buffett does the same thing, right? He looks at the business. He doesn't run those businesses. Tony Robbins owns 300 businesses. Do you think he worries about the day-to-day operations of those businesses? No. So you can do the same thing here, right? So as long as you understand the product that you're making, your expertise can go into that. But yeah, you don't have to know everything about running the day-to-day about the business. And in fact, for small business owners, if they don't know anything about running the day-to-day, they should get someone that does. And I think that's a mistake a lot of those small business owners don't do, is they don't they don't give up enough control in areas that they probably should.
I deal mostly with solopreneurs. So if
Mhm.
I hear about big companies, it's either through a Globe and Mail, which is our local business post, or the Wall Street Journal. I'm interested in your take about the difference between organic mergers and the vice presidents of the billion-dollar companies that whole levels of management are buying or selling businesses as their livelihood. What's your take on that?
We have a big advantage if we're small investors. There's a lot more companies to buy, right? And the problem is when you get really big, right? If you want to do $1 billion acquisition, there aren't that many companies to choose from. And so you're right. They try to fit a square peg in a round hole. They're like, all right, we got to do $1 billion acquisition. All right, what's out there? Well, we got these 15 companies. Well, none of these really fit what we're doing now, but we got to spend that money, so we better buy one. And I've seen that. And a lot of times that doesn't end well, right? And I think you've seen that as well. But then there are other companies that are a little more patient. So Apple's a good example of that. It's not that they haven't done acquisitions, but my goodness, do they have a cash hoard that they just sit on? Buffett's another one, right? He'll sit on that for a long time until he sees the right acquisition. He's not in a hurry. The problem is with private equity and some of these other large companies, they have some metric that they have to meet to spend X amount of money or buy X businesses, and they just buy what's available, right? Sort of like going to the restaurant, right? Well, I'm going to go to the restaurant. I want to eat, and here's the menu. And I'm hungry, so I got to eat something, but nothing on the menu is appealing. What do? That's usually get something to eat anyway. And what happens? That meal gives you indigestion, right? So acquisitions is sometimes the same.
You help companies get funding for their projects. So some people have the understanding that I'm a startup, that's how I'm going to get my funding. begs to a couple questions come out of this is what type of funding and how do you help founders tap into acquisition funding to buy a startup? Or instead of investing, I've got the widget. Now I got to buy that company over there. And I think from our previous conversation, why not buy something that's already built and running, assuming there's no dead bodies buried under the floorboard somewhere, metaphorically speaking, or otherwise. How do you find that funding, and what's the best path, and what's the least negative outcome for the startup?
All right. So we'll talk about funding in two ways, right? So the startup route or the acquisition route, right? So you're going to access funding in different ways depending on what you want to do. If you're actually really going to go the startup route, that funding is typically some type of investor, right? So it could be a lot of companies do what they call a friends and family round, right? So they put their own money in, or they ask the rich uncle for money. Some people put it all on credit cards. I've seen that. Take a second mortgage on their house. So there are ways to get money. And then traditional bank funding could work there in some cases as well. But normally what the founders are doing is they're really trying to get to a place where so they can access venture capital, right? And so that's where I think it gets a little hazardous for them because if they haven't done this before and the venture capital firm does, who do you think is going to get the better deal, right? That's the first thing. And the second thing is they're giving away so much equity in their company. So I don't have a specific example, but I've heard stories. I can't remember the company, but basically they had a Silicon Valley unicorn. They sold their company for $1 billion and the founders made almost no money because they had given away so much of the equity, right? And so they get so worried about having money, they keep giving away more and more and more. And so I think that's the real issue I see with going that traditional route is just how much equity they give away and sometimes control, right? So they may give away equity and control of their company if they go the venture capital route. But that's the way that you would get funded there. Me personally, the way I would help startups is I have some connections in my network that's what they focus on. They help startups not only get funded, but become fundable. And that's one of the big mistakes founders make is they start looking for capital before they're really ready to ask for it. And you kind of need to get to a certain place. You have to position yourself properly. You have to have the right investor deck to make yourself fundable. And so I have contacts in that area that I can move founders toward. So that's on the traditional side. For the acquisition side, the best way to do it, of course, is if you could self-fund it, right? But we probably don't have the money in our back pocket to do this. But there's lots of ways to access capital there. Again, you could go, and the key thing here is that you can patch a bunch of these together. You don't just pick one and say, I'm going to do it that way. You can get some money from this and some money from this and some money for this and put together what's called a deal stack, right? To do the deal. In the US, right, we have the SBA loans. That's a very good option for small first-time business owners to either start or buy a business. So that's a good one. It comes with a little bit of a hitch though, right? Because you have a personal guarantee on SBA loans. And I've seen that go bad for some small business owners. They didn't really understand what that meant. Oh, well, I'll just declare bankruptcy. Well, that doesn't get you out of an SBA loan. They come after your personal finances. So it could be a good route to take, but there is risk to it. And then I also have connections in some private equity that will actually fund people like this. So most people think about private equity just going out and buying companies whole. And a lot of them do that. But a lot of smaller boutique firms will take a minority stake. And there's also something called search funds where they will help these folks that want to buy a business and they will give them capital for an equity stake. And then another one that I learned about that I didn't know early on was the seller may finance your purchase for you, right? And so again, maybe that's not 100%, but it can be a piece of it. So if you can get money from different places, you can put it together. But it's really can be a good deal for you, to buy the company with other people's money. It's better, in my opinion, if it's debt than equity. But, you can do a mix of both. And I'm actually working on a deal myself right now where I'm thinking that an equity partner might be a good deal because it would give me a nice influx of cash that I can use for operating capital once I take over the business. So there's no one right way to do it. If you're creative, you can come up with a really interesting way of doing it.
Like any guest who brings vendor take back into the conversation, you had me at hello, Dave. Whether you wrote it or whether you've seen it, if you are, I would call it on Main Street instead of Wall Street, is there a primer that you can send our listeners to get them thinking before they're ready to call Dave?
Yeah, I mean, one person that is very popular on YouTube is Cody Sanchez. So the Cody Sanchez videos I think are very informative for people. So I've been in her community in the past, and so yeah, she makes it really easy to understand. Her I think her favorite is laundromats is something that people can go after. But the things that she teaches, you could apply to any type of acquisition. And then there's another gentleman called Roland Frazier. He runs the community called Epic. He has a lot of great content as well. And then the last one I'll mention is Jeremy Harbor and the Harbor Club. So he has some great content. And those aren't the only ones, but those are the three that I'm most familiar with.
Thanks. Are there any myths around funding that people have, or not enough depth knowledge that you find?
Yeah. Actually, let me think about that. I think the biggest myth is that that there's only one way to do it. I think that's the people really get stuck on that aspect. Is that, well, I don't have this or I don't have that, but there are just so many ways to do it. I mentioned before the deal stack, right? So just be creative. I think that's the thing. For me, my biggest myth early on was thinking that only rich people bought companies, right? And so I learned that just wasn't true. Now, if you do your homework and you make good connections, there are lots of ways you can do this.
Are you finding that, because one of the things I've seen that if I was going to get involved with a commercial real estate venture, I need the realtor broker. So, and then I need the accountant, and then I need the person to do analysis of the premises to make sure there's no hidden surprises on the floorboard, so to speak. Is that the same thing then for when you're seeking funding or you're looking to buy another business? You have to have a team assembled around you to make sure you get not only the T's crossed and the I's dotted, but also, yeah, it's a good idea. And not just the one with the pitfalls, but it's an absolutely good idea.
I think it's more than a good idea. I think it's an absolute necessity. I told you I know someone that's bought 25 companies. Part of the reason he was able to buy 25 companies is because he has a deal team. And so he's really smart. He really knows how to read balance sheets and P&Ls, but he doesn't do everything himself. And he lets the experts do their expert work, right? So at a minimum, you would want someone that really knows financials, like a CFO type, to really dig in to that aspect of it. You absolutely need a lawyer, and not just any lawyer, right? You really need one that focuses on M&A transactions to help you craft the deal properly. And then also on your due diligence team, right? You need those folks to really dig in. Like I said, I think the legal due diligence is probably the place that can hurt you the most. And then me personally, I reach out to people that have done it more than me to help coach me. So I think that's always wise as well. The thing is, and this is true of everything, right? Once you get too far into it, two things happen. One, you get what's called deal heat, right? And so you want it to happen so bad, right? And so you might overlook things because of that. So having that outside perspective, right, that's not really totally invested in it, literally, can be really helpful and really saving you from making a mistake. One person told me, he said, the best deal you ever make might be the one you walk away from, right? So you really have to protect yourself. And if it's your first deal, right? If your first deal is a bad deal, you may never do another one. And so you really want to make sure you go through the right way, protect yourself, and make sure it works for you. So I had a conversation with someone else this morning that was asking about a deal I'm working on right now. And I said, I think they really need to sell their company. I don't really need to buy it. And that's the mindset I have to keep throughout the whole negotiation is I don't need that. They need to get rid of it I don't need to buy it. And so if you keep that mindset, it will help you, cool down a little bit, not get into deal heat, but, be patient.
Can you write a book called Deal Heat? That's got to be the most powerful concept I've heard in a year.
So that's not my term, but it's very.
One thing I like here, I read bios and I pick up little things. You have an anti-fragile Friday mastermind. Man, I even like the language. Tell me a story.
Yeah. So that's it's with another organization that I'm involved with called Strategic Value Plus Solutions, right? So they're an organization that helps manufacturing of all sorts. So they're really focusing right now on onshoring. But the Anti-Fragile Friday, it came from that book, right? Anti-Fragile. And one of our guest speakers, he's there most of the time, is Dr. Alan Barnard. And he's the CEO of Gold Rat Research Labs. And he's a decision scientist, and he's one of the leading global experts in theory of constraints. And so the idea is that it's by invitation only. And so we have a small curated room, and it's kind of a mastermind. And the idea is to help small business owners get in this room with people that have seen and done some pretty big things and be able to tap their knowledge to address some struggles they're having in their business right now. Thank you for asking.
When you suggest someone buy a company as opposed to starting from scratch, where you're going to leverage that company to help fund your own project, do you start making it one corporate entity, or is it a subsidiary? Is there a specific structure you work with? And then like shareholder agreements, how does that spin in there? Because you have two entities, you merge them under one box, keep them separate. Is there a strategy behind that?
You should have a strategy. And again, this is one of those things, there's lots of ways to do it. But what's key is if you're going to buy a company, it's not you buying it. That's the first thing. So use what's called a special purpose vehicle, right? So you would create an entity and then use that entity to buy that business. And you can do this in one of two ways. Typically, you can either do a stock purchase or an asset purchase, right? So if you create an SPD and you're doing an asset purchase, then basically what you're saying is this new entity that I built is buying all the assets from that, and we're creating a new company, right? That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is, and the one I'm working on right now is going to be a stock purchase. But when you're doing a stock purchase, you still won't have another entity buy it. So in my case, I have a holding company, and my holding company is going to buy that company. So it will be a wholly owned subsidiary of my holding company. And you do that for a couple of reasons. The main one is you want to distance yourself as much as you can to de-risk it, right? So if you create an LLC, what's that called? It's a limited liability corporation. What that means is it limits your personal financial liability in that structure so that if that business fails and goes bankrupt, they don't come and take your house, right? So it's really important to only do an acquisition through a special purpose vehicle. And how it's done, it depends. And then there are other things that come into play, right? Let's say you're buying a company and they own the property as well, right? And they now have that in one business entity. Most people I know like to split those out into two separate entities. So they would do the acquisition, but they would then buy all the assets of the company in one LLC, and then they would buy the real estate in a separate LLC and keep them separate. That's most commonly what I see. Again, there are caveats that may make you want to do more than the other. The same with rolling up two companies, right? So let's say I was talking about the electronics and the metals company before. You could do it one of two ways. You could actually absorb the other entity, right? And it just becomes part of your company. Or you could buy that and keep it as a separate business entity and then just work with each other through some contracting agreement. Again, it depends on what your strategy is, what you're comfortable with. It also might depend on where you live, right? So there might be advantages to doing it one way versus another, depending on your location in the world.
Yes, the taxman must love that, or the tax accountant. How do I sort through this? And where do the revenues come in and out? From a supply chain perspective, let's say, the plastics, like again, from our previous conversation, they're making plastic components that you need for your product. And so you're now leveraging that business to make the product, but also they do other sales. So it helps generate revenue. How is there Is there any issue or anything you got to be mindful of? Going, okay, this company earns $100 a day type thing. It needs 30 to survive and not survive, but function properly. Skimming off a portion of that to feed my other venture. Are there any pitfalls or things you have to be mindful of when you kind of shape that, so you don't end up having a hole in the floor, so to speak, when you least expect it, or overextend yourself?
Yeah, that can be a concern. So I'll give you another specific example. One of the companies I'm looking at right now, it's one of a bunch of companies that the conglomerate owns, and so it's been kind of hurting for a while, and they've been throwing cash at it, right? And so that's the concern, right? Is you don't want one company to prop up the other company. So me personally, I wouldn't siphon off much cash from company A to support company B. I'd say company B, you have to survive on your own. Otherwise I don't want you. Right. So you can't have that crutch. Even though I have this other company, you can't have their cash flow. You have to create your own. You have to show me that you can do this. Again, there are probably caveats when larger companies might have that as, a so-called strategic acquisition for some reason. And maybe that's losing money and they don't care because they're making it up somewhere else. But as a small business owner, if you have two small businesses, that's probably not the way you want to operate. I saw that happen personally here in my hometown, where an owner had a business that was pretty successful and they bought another business that they thought would be complementary, and it wasn't. And so they kept pumping more and more cash, thinking all they needed was time and it would turn around. And it looks like it might destroy both businesses. So you're absolutely right that that's a really big concern. Another way that you could do this, though, instead of just giving the money to the other company, you can loan it money, right? You can get credit in your corporation, just like you can get personal credit. The cool thing about corporate credit is, it's actually easier to get. You have to be intentional about it, though. It's not automatic. So a lot of companies don't even know this, but you have to actually really purposely build your corporate credit. But the thing is you can get a really high leverage amount of corporate credit on your company. And then you could use that and give that as a loan to another company, or you could even use it to fund an acquisition, right? But then you're still loaning it, not giving it to it. And so I think that's the danger, is when you're taking cash from one company and just giving it to another company, right? They don't have any, there's no imperative for them to do better if people, it's like a spoiled kid, right? It's like the spoiled kid. If you keep giving them $50 every time they ask and go out the door, they're not going to get a job. They're not going to do anything different. So you do have to be careful about that.
Hopefully you don't talk to my mother.
Yeah.
Dave, I'm trying to understand that I think you have a great answer for is find this business, I trip over this business that I think I want to buy to add to my portfolio. How do I make sure I have the bandwidth? Do I put in a lead hand? Do I make sure I have my own business running almost too smoothly? Do I trust the management of the company I'm buying implicitly? How do you make sure you have the bandwidth to run that, to help run that company and not take away from yours?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And that's something I'm struggling with personally right now, because even if you buy a company, I'll give you an example. I came across a company a while ago. It wasn't really in my wheelhouse. It was a brewery, but it was an absent owner. The brewery was in New Jersey. He lived in Florida. So he says, yeah, you don't have to do anything. I don't do anything. Well, that may or may not be true once you look under the hood, right? And so any acquisition that you do, expect for a short period of time, and maybe even a longer period of time, it's going to kind of have to be a full-time job, right? You're going to have to look at that really closely, even if you do trust the management. The problem is when businesses change hands, it spooks employees, right? And so even if they're a great team and they like what they want, you don't know that company, you don't know that culture. There may have been something the previous owner promised them that you don't know about, and they didn't get it, and they're disgruntled and they leave. Maybe the manager that's running the company thought that they were going to be the new owner, he was going to sell it to him, and he didn't. They may end up leaving. You don't know. You just don't know, right? It's that black swan thing again, right? You don't know. I had this happen to someone I know where they just started the new company and there was a disaster, fire, flood, whatever. those type of things. And if they've never dealt with that before, they might need help. And, you being on the ground could be helpful. So it's really tricky. The smaller the business it is, the harder it is, right? So private equity thinks about this all the time because private equity, they don't run businesses, right? So they want to buy a business and just have it run. Again, like Buffett. Buffett does that too. He's like, I'm only going to buy a business that's already running well because I want it to just keep doing what it's doing, right? But if you buy a small business, that owner sometimes is about, doing about 80% of the stuff in that building. And so, yeah, they say they're going to stick around for a little while, but after they sell, they're going to tune out a little bit too. So if you don't have a plan for filling that gap, you might be the one filling the gap.
Dave, who's your ideal customer?
Well, it depends on what we're talking about. So for consulting, my ideal customer is a sub $10 million manufacturing business, right? So making a physical product. Family-owned business. I really like working directly with owners for two reasons. One, it's more gratifying to help these small business owners. And secondly, there's a lot less bureaucracy, right? I don't have to get in and talk to a committee of 12 to get them to do something. It's just one person. So that's what I really like.
I like that. So Dave, if someone wanted to get a hold of you because, hey, I've got plans. I just don't know how to make them thread them together. How do they get a hold of you, and what areas do you serve?
Yeah, it's actually really easy to get a hold of me. So you can find me on LinkedIn, and I have a button you can click to get time on my calendar. And then I also, if you go on the info, my email address and my phone number is on my LinkedIn profile. And then you can also go to my website, FocusOPEX.com, and there's a way to contact me through that as well. So I'm actually very accessible.
Excellent. Wayne, you have any other questions?
How do I get my 10 million, Dave?
Just for smiling?
How do you get your 10 million for, what are you going to do with it?
That's the part I'm not doing as well on.
All right. So, yeah, I mean, the best way to get your 10 million is to go buy a business. I mentioned Jeremy Harbour earlier. And so he has a tagline. The answer to everything is buy a business. You can solve any problem by buying a business. So, yeah, that's the best way to build generational wealth. Is to buy a business. But the key thing, and I think a lot of small business owners don't recognize this, you make your real money when you sell it. And so you need to grow it to a place that you're going to get a good exit when you sell it. There are people that's why private equity is there, right? They make money. They buy a company, they pump it up, and then they sell it. And they make all their money on the sale, right? That's your plan, Wayne. Just to go start buying some businesses.
Dave, I want to say thank you so much. Folks, I just want to remind you, Anti-Fragile Friday Masterminds. Reach out to Dave about that. Every Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern or 8 a.m. Pacific. I want to say thank you to Dave McFarland, my co-host Wayne Pratt, and you, Knack for Business listeners. Dave works to make real differences by giving business owners the tools and confidence to scale faster, stronger, turning fragile ventures into anti-fragile, resilient companies. That's what you want to be, solid as a rock. Reach out to Dave. He can help provide you that path and throw you into that box.
To reach the podcast hosts, email them at info@creativeinsight.com or by the website creativeinsight.com, spelled KREATIVISIGHT.com. To reach Wayne at his email, wayne@motive8u.ca, that is MOTIVE, the numeral 8 and the letter U.ca, or his website, motive8u.ca. If you would like to be a guest on this podcast and share your knowledge, let us know. We would also appreciate your feedback on the content or format. Check the show notes for more details. For these podcasts, we like to acknowledge the support and thanks to the following people. Carl Richards from Podcast Solutions Made Simple, a renowned podcast expert. Fred Crouch, who is the Property Wizard podcaster, where Bernie is a co-host. Jovan Strika from At Hive, a co-working space that is more than just a space. Then Melanie Weber, Bernie's invaluable business partner, and Wayne Pratt from Motive8U Inc., who serves as both a coach and co-host of these podcasts. Disclaimer. Please note that the Knack for Business podcast episodes are meant solely for educational and general informational purposes. The information and opinions contained within are not intended to be professional advice on any subject matter. The thoughts, views, and opinions expressed by the participants are their own personal beliefs and do not represent the views of the podcast hosts or any affiliated organizations. It is important to note that this podcast is not a replacement for consulting with certified experts in your area who possess knowledge of your unique situation. The hosts of the podcast, along with any participants or affiliated groups, do not take responsibility for any actions taken or not taken based on the information presented in this episode. It is highly recommended that individuals seek guidance from their own personal advisors in fields such as accounting, law, or other pertinent areas prior to undertaking any actions or making decisions that may impact their financial, legal, or other aspects of life.